If you've ever felt trapped in that endless top 40 loop, you know the feeling. Same songs, same sounds, same safe choices. Like the world hit repeat and lost the button to try something new. Today, I want to introduce you to a crew that's built to do the exact opposite. Change the station entirely. Bullet End Flight is based right in the heart of the 505, Albuquerque, where the green chili runs hot and the creative energy somehow runs even hotter. And when I say Bullet End Flight, I'm not talking about one single project or one single vibe. Think of it more like a parent company to a whole family of artistic misfits. People who don't fit neatly into the usual boxes, and honestly, don't want to. At the center of everything is a mission that's pretty simple to say, but not always easy to pull off. Elevate the voices that usually get talked over. The artists who get labeled too niche, or too different, or that weird one, too Albuquerque. Whatever that's supposed to mean. If you've ever heard something like that about your work, this is your invitation to pull up a chair. Because that's not a deal breaker here. That's the whole point. Bullet End Flight is built around inclusivity, creative community building, and giving underrepresented artists the megaphone they deserve. Not as a trend, not as a marketing angle, but as the core identity. It's a response to a creative world that can feel gated, filtered, and overly polished, where the most interesting voices get told to tone it down so they can be easier to sell. And here's where it gets fun. Bullet End Flight doesn't believe in staying in one lane. Because why would you? Why drive a sedan when you could take a spaceship? The whole approach is more like, what does human expression look like across every format? And then going after all of it. Let's start with music, because that's a major part of the DNA. The mindset here isn't pick a genre and stay in it. It's more like, what's the vibe, and does it hit? That can mean the spiritual charge of gospel, the late-night pulse of house music, the smooth storytelling and emotion of R&B, or even that classic country charm where life falls apart but somehow the drink is still cold. It's not about fitting into a category. It's about making something that feels alive. But it doesn't stop at music. There's a strong dedication to the spoken word too. Podcasts that get into the real stuff, not just surface-level chatter, and poetry that doesn't play nice. The kind that lands heavy, the kind that says what people avoid saying, the kind that reminds you words can still be dangerous in the best way. Then there's film and TV writing. Getting into scripts that actually have a heartbeat. Not another recycled reboot of a reboot. Not something designed by committee to offend the fewest people possible. The focus is on stories with soul. Stories with perspective. Stories that sound like they came from real lives, in real places, with real edges. And of course, the stage. Because there is nothing like live performance. It's unpredictable, it's electric, and yeah, anything can happen. And usually does. The stage is where art stops being an idea and becomes a moment, right in front of people who can feel it in real time. So why would an artist want to plug into something like this? Because being a starving artist has been romanticized for way too long, and it doesn't need to be the default. And being a lonely artist, trying to build everything by yourself, with no village, no network, no support, that's even worse. Bullet and Flight is about building that village on purpose. The goal is to take the talent that's been brewing in the Southwest, often overlooked, often underestimated, and project it outward. Not in a please notice us kind of way, but in a we're already here, and we're bringing the whole sound with us kind of way. Bullet and Flight positions itself as a launch pad, a safety net, and the hype you didn't realize you were missing. And let's be honest, a lot of people are tired of gatekeepers. Tired of needing permission. Tired of feeling like they have to sand down everything interesting about their work to be taken seriously. If that's you, this is a space that's built for finding your tribe. People who want loud, weird, real art, and who aren't afraid to make it together. If you want to get in the mix, deombase is https://justdominic. And if you want the visuals, you can find the YouTube channel at @justdominic music. Bullet and Flight Music, LLC is the company behind it all. And the invitation is open. Check out what's being built, listen to what's coming out, and if you're ready to change the station, this is a good place to start.
Inside Out on Bullet and Flight Radio. Real discussions with mental wellness professionals.
Welcome, everyone. As folks, or as my lovely hosts here noted, my name is Mel Wilcox. A little bit about me. I'm a counseling psychologist and past president of APA Division 17, Society of Counseling Psych. I am also a member of the Supervision and Training section, which is the host section for today's webinar, and I really love our supervision and training home. I am also a licensed psychologist and board certified in counseling psychology. I'm a full-time academic, but I do also practice part-time, and that includes providing direct clinical services to clients, but I also provide supervision in the context of our private practice as well. So both on the scholarly side and on the practice side, supervision is a major part of what I do. Don't need to spend all that much time on me. And in fact, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the plan for today. We have an hour, a little bit less now, right? And an hour goes by quickly. And one of the things that we found ourselves presented with, shall we say, is that we really have multiple audiences here today. This webinar is almost kind of the second in a series. I did a very similar webinar a little over a year ago now, where we covered some of the same content that we're going to cover today. I think some of it might be a little bit different or new or updated. And that first one was at the request of students also. And so we talked about some didactic stuff related to clinical supervision and culturally and structurally responsive approaches to clinical supervision. But a guiding question that led to the first webinar, in fact, as I understand it, is how do we work with supervisors who we feel as though are not being culturally or structurally responsive, especially in the context of the power dynamic, right? And I tried to speak to it a little bit, but what's tough is that the answers to that could be very different depending on the who and the what and the when and the where. And I can't be the sole arbiter of, what to do in a situation like that. And students are in a tough position in the power dynamic to attend to those issues that arise in clinical supervision. I can tell you what the research says. I can tell you how you might be able to approach a difficult conversation with me as a supervisor, but that could be very different with somebody else, right? So not surprisingly, after the last webinar, the students were like, that's all great, but what do we do with our clinical supervisors and clinical supervision who we feel as though are not necessarily engaging in cultural or structural responsiveness? We're still left with this question, right? So that led to doing a second webinar. But providing continuing education credit and over a lunch hour, at least on Eastern time, meant that we have a predominantly professional audience, it seems as though, from the registrants, right? And so then we were sort of left with, okay, how do we attend to where everybody's at, both in terms of what folks might want or need from this webinar and in terms of even amongst the professional group, right? Everyone may have different levels of exposure to some of that information. It's always tough to cover everybody's needs and zones of proximal development in a single webinar. I think it's extra tough today. And so my tentative goal was to cover some didactic content, which we're going to do in the front end, and then for us to work together to answer some tough questions. We now know in the kind of like pivoting that the way that this particular format was set up wasn't necessarily ready for us to have like back and forth discussion with video and audio. I can't see it anymore, but when I last checked, now I can see it. There were 288 of you initially. There are now 319. And so, maybe we don't need 319 cameras on anyway. It might not be the worst thing. There's group process, and then there's whatever that would be. So my new pivot to that is I want to reorient everyone to the student's question before we get started. And then as we get closer to the end, I want us to revisit that question. And if you put things in the chat, they will come to me and the rest of the hosts and the panelists. And then I can sort of share out some of the things that I'm hearing. The other nice part about that is that, again, this is recorded and it may be posted on our YouTube channel. And so by doing it that way, it means that if you have some ideas or even reactions or thoughts about barriers that are coming up for you about how to address these difficult issues in clinical supervision, you can submit your responses to me and I can de-identify them and sort of share out what I'm hearing. So your name, your face wouldn't be tied to your response in the recording or in its public posting. So maybe that'll help the discussion a little bit, even though it might not feel like a discussion since it's all being funneled through me. But we're building the plane while flying it today. I trust the process. I believe it will all be okay. And yes, toward the end, I will make sure to drop the slides in the chat as well. If you have questions throughout, make sure to put them in the Q&A box, and I will try to keep an eye on that as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about clinical supervision. This could be really Basics 101, but I never like to assume that people showing up to a webinar on supervision are exposed to the clinical supervision literature. And really foundational to my understanding of clinical supervision, and one of my favorite quotes about clinical supervision, is this quote by Fiscalini. The supervisory relationship is a relationship about other relationships. And what I love about this is it speaks to the complexity of clinical supervision and how many lives we are touching through the process of clinical supervision. It's really easy to imagine it as just a dyadic process between the supervisor and the supervisee. But of course, we have a relatively direct impact on the clients with whom our supervisees work. And then, of course, those clients' lives are peopled, right? And the progress that they are or aren't making in therapy, what's coming up in therapy, that's going to affect their interpersonal universe as well. So there's a real ripple effect bidirectionally. Between the supervisor, the supervisee, and all the universes to which everyone is attached. And I feel like this Fiscalini quote really helps us tap into that complexity. So as clinical supervisors, we have three primary responsibilities. Of course, we've got lots of task responsibilities and sub-responsibilities. But generally speaking, the things that are the most important to our responsibilities as a supervisor are first and foremost the supervisory relationship. This always comes first because we can't really accomplish the other two without a strong supervisory relationship, as we know from the research, and we'll see in a recap of that research here in just a moment. So the supervisory relationship first and foremost. After that, and on the basis of that, supervisee development, and then the quality of the psychotherapy or clinical services provided to the client by the supervisee, quality control, basically. And decades of research shows us again and again that supervisor behaviors and supervisor qualities have predictable positive and negative consequences along each of these responsibilities. We know from the research things that are related to positive relationships, positive supervisee development, positive client clinical care, and we know some things that undermine those as well. I can just get my slides to advance. There we go. And so this is just a brief summary of just some of the things that we know. We're very fortunate that at this point, the supervisory literature is really robust and we've got some really cool complex studies. But I like to start with like the basic high level summaries of what are some of those things that we know are related to positive outcomes, right? The answer is quite a bit, and Bernard and Goodyear do a fantastic job in their textbooks of summarizing this as still a summary, but in greater length than I could possibly do here. But I want to call just a few things out. We know, measured in a few different ways, that the cultural responsiveness of the clinical supervisor is related to positive outcomes or inversely negative outcomes when it's not there. We know that experiencing microaggressions of any kind, including racial and gendered microaggressions in the context of supervision, is related to negative outcomes with supervisees. Supervisee stress and anxiety is related to poor supervisory working alliance in addition to impacts on clinical care. So things that we do or don't do as supervisors that engender stress or anxiety, or that don't buffer stress and anxiety, we know that those have a negative impact on the working alliance and clinical care. And we know that being able to have frank discussions about supervisor and supervisee race, and I would argue positionality and systems of oppression more broadly, and the supervisor having more advanced racial identity development than the supervisee is related to a stronger supervisory working alliance, and through that, better outcomes. Again, I said everything works through a positive supervisory working alliance. And so here we see the other side of that equation, right? When we can develop a strong supervisory alliance with our supervisees, it's the necessary but insufficient thing, right? Does it mean that all we need to do is have a great relationship with our supervisee? Of course not. We have other responsibilities as well, right? But once we attend to that strong supervisory working alliance, then we can attend to some of those other responsibilities. The one that I love to call attention to when I am working with largely the professional groups and lots of professionals in the audience today is the research on disclosure and non-disclosure. We know that when there is a strong working alliance between the supervisor and the supervisee, that the supervisee is much more likely to tell us things that they might not want to tell us, things that might be hard to share when when they're worried that they made an error. And of course, a lot of the times they're more worried about errors that aren't really errors than anything else. But maybe sometimes a risk assessment wasn't done, or, they're worried about how the dynamic is unfolding, things that we would want to know as a supervisor, right? And we find that when supervisees aren't experiencing a strong working alliance with their supervisor, they're much more likely to hide those things from us. And for one, that's a huge liability issue, which is why I love to raise it with the professional groups. We can't attend to our own liability if we don't know what's going on. I don't care how diligent of a supervisor you are. We cannot watch every minute of every hour of every session of all of our supervisees and their clients. Right? We are relying on their disclosure. So we cannot adequately attend to even liability if our supervisees are not willing to disclose things to us. And then, of course, even beyond the bare minimum, like liability stuff, we can't attend to their development. We can't support them the way that they need to be supported. And we can't monitor client care if we don't know what's going on in their therapy, right? So we are very reliant on supervisee self-disclosure, and there's no way around that. And the best way to ensure that we know what's going on with and for our supervisees is to foster a strong supervisory working alliance. It also helps ensure that supervisees are satisfied with their supervision, which is a significant benefit to their professional identity development. And so there's a lot of positive benefits to that supervisory working alliance. There have been a lot of models of culturally responsive care over the decades. But in the past 10, 15 years or so, there's been a shift from multicultural competence, and I'm going to emphasize multicultural there because we are finding our way back to some other competence models, and toward a more process-oriented model of multicultural orientation. And we have some preliminary research now in supervision, like I would say pretty robust preliminary research, showing very real benefits to supervision of multicultural orientation. So MCO, multicultural orientation, is a way of viewing and understanding the world, which is why we're using that language rather than a destination of competence where I've learned all the things, right? This is a lens, it's a way of being. It's a process model rooted in the contextual model, which Wampold and Amel cover in the great psychotherapy debate, that is focused much more on the things that we know are empirically related to better outcomes in psychotherapy, which is largely therapist characteristics and the process, right? All the what they call specific ingredients are great and they do add to positive outcomes, but the most robust findings are related to the therapeutic working alliance and the therapist characteristics, as well as client characteristics, right? So the recognition of the importance of process and the empirical support for process in psychotherapy is the grounding for the MCO model. It is focused much more on a way of being in therapy or supervision than a way of doing. This also helps us better account for intersectionality. I started out as a multicultural competence researcher and giving lots of presentations, teaching classes on multicultural competence as well. And something that I ran into quite a bit was people becoming very quickly overwhelmed once we started to introduce the idea of intersectionality. Because if we're thinking from a competence framework and the idea is that we have to know all of these literatures in order to be minimally competent to work with a particular client or supervisee, then when we start layering on intersectionality, and you imagine this like a matrix, like addressing model by addressing model, and you think about all the different combinations of identities, if we're thinking in an identity way, where you would have to know all of these different literature bases in order to be competent, yeah, that's not only overwhelming, it is not possible to learn all of those things in advance of working with anyone who might walk into your therapy or supervision room, right? So the overwhelm made a lot of sense to me. I didn't have a great answer for it, but it made a lot of sense to me. Whereas from an MCO standpoint, because of its core pillars of cultural humility, first and foremost, of course, we still want some baseline knowledge, but one of the most important principles of MCO to me is the idea that MCO, when we are strong in these qualities and characteristics, it motivates us to learn what we need to learn when we need to learn it. And we can feel kind of less activated when we're presented with something new and more centered and grounded in the like, okay, I'm going to meet this person where they are at. And then when I leave here today, I'm going to go learn the things that I need to go learn so that I can be more prepared to work with this person. To me, I see MCO and its pillars as kind of modern core conditions. Once again, not sufficient. There are more things we need beyond MCO, even in cultural and structural responsiveness, but they are prerequisite. And I think the empirical support we have for MCO, to me, really drives that point home. So there are three pillars to multicultural orientation, and cultural humility is the central pillar. It is often called the central organizing construct of MCO. And there are two components to it: an interpersonal component, being other-oriented, curious, perspective-taking, lacking a sense of superiority, and an intrapersonal perspective, having an accurate view of ourselves to include our limitations, but it also means a holistic, accurate view of ourselves. So it's not meant to be just a self-denigrating thing. It's I have a good sense of my strengths, my weaknesses, my growth edges, right? Cultural comfort is the second pillar, and this is often defined as the therapist or supervisor's thoughts or feelings that emerge before, during, and after conversations about cultural identities, culturally focused content, or oppression. And I think about this a lot because people, especially trainees, will often say, great, how do I get to the comfort place, right? And I don't know that comfort, sometimes we even say it's like a sense of ease. I don't know about that sometimes, because I think it's really more about tolerance of discomfort than it is, this feels like a spa day, you know? It isn't that everything feels easy or that everything feels wonderful and is kittens and rainbows when we're having tough discussions, but it means that we're able to have tough discussions, tolerating the discomfort that is inherent in difficult dialogues, not feeling overly activated, feeling like we can be present and centered and attuned, right? Because activation is a barrier to attunement. And in any relationship, we want good attunement. So to me, I think of comfort more as that tolerance of discomfort and being able to self-regulate really well in difficult situations. And then cultural opportunities are cultural markers that occur in therapy. Again, the tradition that this is kind of born out of, very much intentionally using that marker language from emotion-focused therapy. The other approaches, other theories have very similar concepts. Is it really is the markers from EFT, points of entry from integrative interpersonal therapy from Tabor and Tabor, or what Yalom describes as needing to develop our rabbit ears for the here and now opportunities, right? These are just culturally or oppression specific markers that occur. And something I really like is that Davis and colleagues in their 2018 paper, kind of introducing MCO, argue that these are always present. It's just that being higher in cultural humility and cultural comfort allows us to better able to recognize those opportunities when they occur and seize upon them, as well as create opportunities. So we've had an opportunity at this point to do quite a bit of research on MCO and clinical supervision. And as a result, we see a lot of empirical support for all three pillars and their impacts on the supervisory working alliance, supervisory satisfaction. And we've even been able to demonstrate in a more complex model in this JCP paper down here on the right that it can be a buffer against racial microaggressions. What we find is that racial microaggressions that happen in the context of supervision, not surprisingly, they're going to be impactful no matter what, right? But a really interesting thing occurred. I should have actually included the graphs, which is that for supervisors who their supervisees rated as low in cultural humility, the relationship was just a flat line across microaggression contexts. So if a microaggression didn't occur, the relationship was still at the floor. And if a microaggression occurred, the relationship was at the floor. Microaggressions didn't have a huge impact on the supervisory working alliance because there wasn't really a supervisory working alliance to impact. And so what we found is that supervisees who experienced racial microaggressions in supervision, they experienced a detriment to the supervisory working alliance with their supervisors who they rated as culturally humble. But part of why that effect was able to happen at all is because there was a working alliance to impact. And even in those conditions, so my supervisor is culturally humble, a racial microaggression still occurred, those supervisees rated their supervisory working alliance higher than they did with supervisors who were not culturally humble and where microaggressions didn't even occur, right? So cultural humility was a substantial relational buffer when it was present. And when it was absent, there was barely a supervisory working alliance to speak of. And I thought that was really important. So on the basis of this increasing evidence base for MCO in general and for clinical supervision, some colleagues and I talked about some necessary ingredients or key ingredients to fostering cultural humility in particular, given its empirical support and its importance. And we specifically described in detail in this article, which was part of a psychotherapy special issue, developing an accurate sense of self, receiving feedback mindfully, having a heightened interpersonal awareness, and maintaining openness and curiosity toward others. And I think we kind of talk about the importance of non-defensiveness in that. We also talked about how important it is to foster critical self-compassion, which might sound like an oxymoron, right? But what we mean here by critical isn't self-critical, but rather in like the critical psychology sense of really being critiquing, including of ourselves, right? So we've defined critical self-compassion as having care and patience for ourselves and reactions that might come up for us in really difficult and activating circumstances, while simultaneously balancing in that moment, holding ourselves accountable for the reaction and where it might be coming from, exercising curiosity for why we might be having that reaction, and allowing ourselves to feel whatever it is that we're feeling without acting out toward others. And again, maybe you're noticing as a room full of therapists is that essentially we're, again, talking about a high level of self-regulation in all of these different ways, right? So we know that ruptures will happen. That's just the nature of relationships. But when we're stronger in multicultural orientation, and the research in both psychotherapy and supervision bears this out, we are more willing to admit our mistakes, which we know is crucial for rupture repair. We're more open, and we're more relationship oriented, which helps with that repair aspect. What's really important to fostering cultural humility and to attending to ruptures especially is tolerating ambiguity. Again, I can't stress enough the importance of emotion regulation in this. Patience with imperfection, tough in the mental health field sometimes, a willingness to be wrong, sometimes even publicly, because sometimes we're not talking about individual supervision. We could be talking about group supervision. We could be talking about a class context or research team. So sometimes doing rupture repair or admitting our mistakes, trying to model MCO for our supervisees means we have to not only admit that we were wrong, but admit so in a more public context than dyadic supervision. And that again can be further activating, right? So it's a muscle that we sometimes have to learn to intentionally strengthen. And it's important to continuously critique the status quo, critique what we have been taught formally or informally, and critique our initial perceptions about things. So in over 20 studies of more than 6,000 psychotherapy clients, probably more from the last time I updated this box, nearing at least 10 supervision studies with hundreds of supervisees, we have unequivocal support for cultural humility, cultural comfort, and cultural opportunities, and their positive effects on process and outcome in both psychotherapy and supervision. But even as we see from that JCP study, right, racial microaggressions still occur, even in high cultural humility contexts. And in our qualitative studies, the supervisees of color, amongst other subsamples, highlighted the need for didactics and discussion, not on quote unquote cultural differences, but on systemic and structural oppression. And this is consistent in the literature with the most common and consistent criticisms of the MCO model. So some colleagues and I have started to talk more about the both and, right? If MCO is core conditions, if MCO is the process aspect, then what is the content aspect? What is the and part of the both and? And Metzl and Hansen, back in 2013, argued that medical education had, and I've argued and continue to argue that this is true of psychology education as well, has been misdirected to focus on the individual and quote unquote cross-cultural understanding to the exclusion of systems and structures of oppression. That doesn't mean that cross-cultural understanding isn't important. It's just something different. It's a different construct than talking about oppression, right? So they've argued, and my colleagues and I have argued, that we need to also focus on and learn about social and systemic forces and their historical antecedents that result in individual health outcomes, that result in disparities, that result in why difficult dialogues are difficult in the first place, right? Because those aren't issues of culture, they're issues of oppression. So extending Metzl and Hansen's structural competence model for medical education, my colleagues and I have argued for porting this over and expanding it in the professional psychology education and training space. So structural competence has 5 principles. The first is recognizing the structures that shape clinical interactions. So in what ways have systems of oppression in an abstract sense, but also specific policies, specific organizational setups, resulted in the fact that we are having to have this clinical encounter at all. Developing an extra clinical language of structure. Not all of the applicable language that we're going to draw from or literatures that we're going to draw from are going to be psychological in nature. Learning to re-articulate cultural presentations in structural terms where appropriate, where that's what we mean to be talking about. Observing and imagining structural intervention, which I would argue is really what the social justice movement has been arguing for 20 plus years. And developing structural humility, which means that psychology is not going to have all the answers to everything, that everything is inherently interspecialty, interdisciplinary, and we need to be pulling from all of these knowledge bases to conceptualize and to intervene. Grzenka called for psychologists in 2020 to consider structural and systemic forces and argued for the implementation of the structural competencies lens and posed 3 new questions. And I also include one that he references from Case as well. Whenever we're thinking about a particular presenting concern or even a relationship dynamic in therapy, in supervision, or otherwise, we should be asking, what role does inequity play? How can I address constructs and systems, not just identities? How is social power operating in this situation? And what roles can psychologists play in addressing the social problem? So our research and guidance are understandably focused on advising supervisors how to best engage in culturally responsive clinical supervision. Whenever I do these webinars, that's usually the focus. A lot of our research is focused on that, right? But as I mentioned at the beginning, this question keeps arising around like, great, we all agree. Yep, we've seen these definitions, we've seen these literatures, we are aware of how things are supposed to go. For students and supervisees in particular, we are aware of the impacts when supervision is not culturally or structurally responsive, right? What do we do about it? And I grappled with that question the first time I was asked. I grappled with it this time and really struggled for a number of reasons. For one, there is no one size fits all answer to that question. The universe of things that could go wrong in supervision, so to speak, are innumerable. And they range from the really subtle and nuanced to the really extreme and worrisome, right? We see this in Ellis and colleagues' inadequate and harmful supervision framework and some of the research that they've done on the incidence rates of both inadequate and harmful supervision. Even thinking about those two buckets, right? And there's many examples of inadequate and or harmful supervision within those two buckets. But even if we just treat them as two separate buckets for a second, how we respond to inadequate supervision is probably going to be very different to how we respond to harmful supervision. And then what type of inadequate supervision are we talking about? Are we talking about a lack of relational attunement? Or are we talking about the fact that supervision isn't regularly scheduled for 1 hour a week the way that it's supposed to be? Both are inadequate. They are very different tasks, very different competencies, very different therapist characteristics or supervisor characteristics at play, right? How we would attend to these things, and specifically how a supervisee in the kind of power down position in that dynamic would attend to it, is very different, right? And then what type of harmful supervision are we talking about? Are we talking about racial microaggressions, or are we talking about some of the especially upsetting incident rates that we see in harmful supervision, like using mood-altering substances with a supervisor, or sexual behavior with a supervisor and a supervisee? Those are very different issues to tend to in the supervisory dynamic, and especially with the power differential, right? So the universe of the ways in which things can go wrong in general, and in the context of culturally and structurally responsive supervision, is vast. And so how to respond to a supervisor, how to try to engage within that dynamic, knowing when you can't engage within that dynamic and you need to seek outside help, how to do that, with whom to do that. The potential answers are as innumerable as the potential problems, right? And the power imbalance itself complicates all of that. If it were as simple as you should tell your supervisor and then they'll fix it, then the question wouldn't arise at all, right? Our students are very smart. And if the solution were simple, they would have figured it out. And so I guess I want to say that to the supervisees in the audience too, right? If the answer were simple, you would have figured it out, because you're all very smart. You're very skilled. That's why you're here. You know, it's why you are astutely asking the question. If there were a simple answer to this, you would have discovered it, you know, on your own, and especially in discussion with your peers. And the answers are complicated, and they are complicated in particular by your position in the power dynamic. And since we're on it, I just happened to see pop up in my screen that someone mentioned or asked for the authors of the inadequate and harmful supervision literature. Absolutely. So the harmful and inadequate supervision framework was articulated by Michael Ellis and colleagues. I think it's in the Counseling Psychologist. It could be the Journal of Counseling Psychology. And I want to say it's 2014 was when the main article with the full model was articulated. So again, that's Michael Ellis and colleagues. And in the title is Harmful and Inadequate Supervision. So if you search one of those two journals, you should find it there. Really important. Also, I always experience it with a lot of dismay whenever I present on that work in detail or reread the article, because lots of things that we would like to hope wouldn't happen in supervision have low base rates, very low base rates relative to other things that arise in supervision. But those base rates aren't zero, and that is dismaying. And so I think everyone should familiarize themselves with that literature. And there's been a good bit of research on it in the ensuing years as well. So the power imbalance complicates things, and the nature of the qualities and characteristics sometimes associated with cultural and structural unresponsiveness in these relationships also don't lend themselves to easy resolution. Not only are our students very smart, so supervisees in the audience here, not only are you very smart, but you also have strengths in interpersonal relationships much of the time. Right? If there were I won't even say easy, if there were a moderately difficult way that you could initiate a tough discussion with your supervisor to get a successful resolution when cultural or structural unresponsiveness is occurring, you would have facilitated that, right? All of the therapy skills that you've learned through your training and the strengths you had in those skills that led you to make your way successfully into graduate psychology education and training, position you well to have navigated this successfully to the extent possible and tried to seek resolution yourself with your supervisor. For one, again, I can't stress enough the power dynamic, right? A lot of our supervisors are also our faculty. Not always the case, depends on your program and your year of training, but the person who you are initiating this difficult discussion with in clinical supervision could be your dissertation chair. They could be your academic advisor. They could be your training director, right? And now approaching this difficult conversation carries a lot more weight, doesn't it? Because the implications are no longer just in this practicum, just in your supervision. Even if it is just the supervision, this person has an evaluative role with you. Their evaluation may carry weight with program faculty. It certainly carries weight in your grade on that practicum, which carries weight in your ability to move forward. That's quite a bit of power to have over a supervisee, right? And there are very few ways around this other than ways that supervisors take with intentionality to try to minimize that power dynamic. And which brings me back to the qualities and characteristics, because a lot of the time, if a supervisor is going out of their way to try to minimize to the extent possible that power dynamic, then the premise of the question is moot, right? That doesn't mean that culturally and structurally unresponsive things won't occur, but a lot of times the discussion is easier to initiate and to engage in by virtue of the qualities and characteristics being demonstrated by that supervisor. So when the questions are being presented about implicitly, like in the toughest circumstances, how do we address this? The combination of power imbalance and the qualities and characteristics often associated with cultural and structural unresponsiveness create some real challenges to answering this question and trying to figure out how to seek resolution, right? So in grappling with this for all these reasons that I have stated, I realized who better to discuss this question than the attendees here today. And again, I shouldn't be the sole arbiter of answering that question anyway. What do we do about this question? So my hope was for us to be able to discuss this. Of course, our format makes that a little bit challenging today, but I want folks to chew on this and share what you're willing to share, either in the chat, which will come to us, or in the Q&A box. Unless you ask me to, I won't share your name. What are supervisees to do when confronted with culturally or structurally unresponsive clinical supervision? If a student brought this question to you, either in general, or I would be willing to bet that a lot of folks here, if you work in any kind of academic or training environment, you have been presented with a version of this question, often in response to a very specific incident occurring. So what might you recommend? What have you recommended for students who are encountering culturally or structurally unresponsive clinical supervision? And while I give folks a minute to to think about that, maybe add some more things in the chat. I'm going to review things that have already been said. And if you've got questions that are coming up for you at the moment, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A as well. While we're thinking, someone asked the question, there is limited research when supervisors are from a marginalized group and working with a supervisee from a majority or privileged group. What is your recommendation for addressing cultural factors when there may be a contradictory power differential? How would you address microaggressions and a lack of cultural orientation in supervisees who are from a privileged group? And for sure, you're right, this is something that is incredibly underrepresented in the literature. And there are a lot of it depends with this as well. And one of the major it depends that comes up for me is the context, right? So if we turn the question into a supervision scenario, right? We have maybe a supervisor of color working with a white supervisee where there are racial microaggressions occurring in the supervisory dyad, and where the racial microaggression is against or is causing harm to the supervisor, right? So yes, the supervisor has power over the supervisee, but at the same time, along racial lines, the power dynamic is flipped. And, the part of what complicates answering what does the supervisor do, right, is what is the climate of the program? Is this person on the academic faculty, or are they a site supervisor? If they're academic faculty, is the tone of the program one that is generally like, if you try to confront it with the student, the rest of the faculty will have your back? Are you pre-tenure? Are you tenure track at all? And everything that I'm touching on is basically about power, right? What other power protections are there for you? How much support do you have? So that it's more of a group intervention. Is there a program-wide expectation that supervisees grow and develop along culturally and structurally responsive anti-oppressive lines? Or is it minimized and negated in the training program? If it's minimized and negated in the training program, it's going to be very difficult for the supervisor to approach the supervisee to try to say, hey, I experienced what you just said this way. I think it's important that we talk about this, both because I'm impacted, right, in our relationship, but also I worry about it impacting other relationships as well. Ideally, we would want to treat that as a cultural opportunity to use the MCO language and say, hey, this thing just happened. It's a rupture, right? Let's talk about this rupture. This is an opportunity, even if it's a painful one, right? And that could go well. It could also backfire. It is helpful to know that you have the support of the rest of the faculty or your administrator, if you are a site supervisor, the program faculty, even if you're a site supervisor, so that if the intervention doesn't go well, that you have some support, because if it doesn't go well, that also has implications for that supervisee's clinical competency, right? They need to be able to tolerate that distress, tolerate the ambiguity, not be defensive. Everything we just said about supervisors, which the research demonstrated first and foremost is important in therapy. We have to be able to address it. And it's important to address it in a relational way. MCO gives us tools to do that. But if you don't have support, then that's a much harder thing to do.
Inside Out on Bullet and Flight Radio. Real discussions with mental wellness professionals.
If you've ever felt trapped in that endless top 40 loop, you know the feeling. Same songs, same sounds, same safe choices. Like the world hit repeat and lost the button to try something new. Today, I want to introduce you to a crew that's built to do the exact opposite. Change the station entirely. Bullet and Flight is based right in the heart of the 505, Albuquerque, where the green chili runs hot and the creative energy somehow runs even hotter. And when I say bullet and flight, I'm not talking about one single project or one single vibe. Think of it more like a parent company to a whole family of artistic misfits. People who don't fit neatly into the usual boxes, and honestly, don't want to. At the center of everything is a mission that's pretty simple to say, but not always easy to pull off. Elevate the voices that usually get talked over. The artists who get labeled too niche, or too different, or that weird one, too Albuquerque. Whatever that's supposed to mean. If you've ever heard something like that about your work, this is your invitation to pull up a chair. Because that's not a deal breaker here. That's the whole point. Bullet and Flight is built around inclusivity, creative community building, and giving underrepresented artists the megaphone they deserve. Not as a trend, not as a marketing angle, but as the core identity. It's a response to a creative world that can feel gated, filtered, and overly polished, where the most interesting voices get told to tone it down so they can be easier to sell. And here's where it gets fun. Bullet and Flight doesn't believe in staying in one lane. Because why would you?
Why drive a sedan when you could take a spaceship?
The whole approach is more like, what does human expression look like across every format? And then going after all of it. Let's start with music, because that's a major part of the DNA. The mindset here isn't pick a genre and stay in it. It's more like, what's the vibe and does it hit? That can mean the spiritual charge of gospel, the late-night pulse of house music, the smooth storytelling and emotion of R&B, or even that classic country charm where life falls apart but somehow the drink is still cold. It's not about fitting into a category. It's about making something that feels alive. But it doesn't stop at music. There's a strong dedication to the spoken word too. Podcasts that get into the real stuff, not just surface-level chatter, and poetry that doesn't play nice. The kind that lands heavy, the kind that says what people avoid saying, the kind that reminds you words can still be dangerous in the best way. Then there's film and TV writing. Getting into scripts that actually have a heartbeat. Not another recycled reboot of a reboot. Not something designed by committee to offend the fewest people possible. The focus is on stories with soul. Stories with perspective. Stories that sound like they came from real lives, in real places, with real edges. And of course, the stage.
Because there is nothing like live performance.
It's unpredictable, it's electric, and yeah, anything can happen. And usually does. The stage is where art stops being an idea and becomes a moment, right in front of people who can feel it in real time. So why would an artist want to plug into something like this? Because being a starving artist has been romanticized for way too long, and it doesn't need to be the default. And being a lonely artist, trying to build everything by yourself, with no village, no network, no support, that's even worse. Bullet and Flight is about building that village on purpose. The goal is to take the talent that's been brewing in the Southwest, often overlooked, often underestimated, and project it outward. Not in a please notice us kind of way, but in a we're already here, and we're bringing the whole sound with us kind of way. Bullet and Flight positions itself as a launch pad, a safety net, and the hype you didn't realize you were missing. And let's be honest, a lot of people are tired of gatekeepers. Tired of needing permission. Tired of feeling like they have to sand down everything interesting about their work to be taken seriously. If that's you, this is a space that's built for finding your tribe. People who want loud, weird, real art, and who aren't afraid to make it together.
If you want to get in the mix, the home base is https://justdominic.
And if you want the visuals, you can find the YouTube channel at @justdominic.music. Bullet and Flight Music, LLC is the company behind it all. And the invitation is open. Check out what's being built, listen to what's coming out, and if you're ready to change the station, this is a good place to start.
Bullet and Flight, fly. Bullet and Flight, fly. Bullet and Flight, bullet and flight, bullet and flight, fly. Bullet and flight, fly. exploring our station. Fly.